welcome to Books for Beneficiaries. My name is Pete Williams, the host of the program on which we talk about the needs of beneficiaries. In estate planning matters, it is the estate owner that takes center stage, and that, of course, is appropriate. It is, after all, their wealth. However, the beneficiary sometimes is left in the dark as to the process. They have needs and questions. They want to ensure that they have their proper inheritance. So I am hopeful that this series will shed some light and give them some information that will help them. I call this series Books for Beneficiaries. So stay tuned for the next chapter and check back for more to come. This episode is a follow-up, part 2 of a 3-part series where we're talking about how assets are invested during the period of administration. When a fiduciary is holding assets that are payable to you at some time in the future. This is not a podcast for the purpose of explaining what you might do with your funds once you receive them. I'm talking about that period of time when assets are held by a third party. It could be a trustee, executor, administrator, which might be an individual. It might be a bank, trust department, or other fiduciary. And it's either awaiting court order in the probate process, or it's awaiting the trustee to complete their duties under the trust. There are delayed or staged payouts that suggest that the settlor or the owner of the estate has said, okay, I want assets to be paid out over a period of time. And that can be for a lot of reasons, but the typical reason is they don't want to dump a lot of assets into the hands of a beneficiary who's sometimes much younger than the estate holder and maybe less experienced with investing assets. What is a staged payout? The example one that I use is that the decedent says, hey, when I die, pay out assets at certain ages. So, for instance, the settlor dies and then pay out 1/4 when the beneficiary attains the age of 35, pay out a third at age 45, pay out a half at age 55, and then the remainder at age 65. So the settlor wants to spread out the distributions. And of course, if the beneficiary has already attained one of these ages, let's say is 47, they typically would get the prior 2 distributions. They would get the 2 distributions at age 35 and 45, and that would be spelled out in a trust document. So one is to distribute assets in accordance with ages. Another might be a time period. For example, when I die, immediately pay out 1/4 of the assets to the beneficiary, and then pay out 1/3 10 years later, 1/2 10 years later, and the remainder 10 years after that. So it's spread out over a period of time. And by the way, these are purely examples. And excuse me for being somewhat of a math nerd. If you think about it, my 1/4, 1/3, and 1/2, and then 100% is approximating a quarter interest at every point. Because when you make out that first 1/4 payment, you've got 3/4 left. So you want to pay out a third of the remainder. And then once you've paid out those 2/4, then you have 2/4 left, and you want to pay half of the remainder. And then finally, that final quarter, or that final 100% of the remainder. So that's the reason I'm using 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, and full. And a third staged payout is simply payout when my beneficiary reaches age 65. So the settlor, for whatever reason, wants the beneficiary to work, and that this inheritance is to be used at or around retirement age. So they don't want the beneficiary to receive assets prior to age 65. It's their money. They can do whatever they want. They can specify any terms they want. And these 3 examples are just 3 that I picked out. There are many, many more. So we can see that when there are staged payouts, either by age, by time, or a delay to a certain age, that there are assets that are held by a fiduciary, typically a trustee. And that trustee has management authority over those assets. So the rule typically is that the trustee has a responsibility for making sure those assets are managed. Now, the trustee may go out and hire an investment agent, an investment advisor to manage those assets. The trustee is under what's called prudent man rule. And really, the prudent man rule simply says that the trustee should do what a prudent person would do in similar circumstances. And they want to get assets to the beneficiary as unscathed as possible, minimal real losses. But at the same time, what we're going to see here is that the trustee wants to make sure that there is no loss of buying power. So to minimize real losses, you would be in very conservative cash type investments. T-bills would have no losses. And yet the future buying power will not keep up with inflation. So over a 40-year period, the price of everything has in the past gone up. Cars are more expensive. Houses are more expensive. So there's a responsibility. A prudent person would invest some of those assets in growth type investments. There's balance. They want to ensure safety, low risk, while providing growth for future buying power. Once they have authority, then they can invest the assets. Every once in a while, a document, whether it be a trust or will dictate investment terms. It's another challenge for the trustee to decide what to do with the inherited portfolio. Again, trustor, the settlor, the estate holder dies, and then somebody takes over their estate. They've inherited a portfolio. And that portfolio typically would be a makeup of asset classes that suited the decedent. So one thing I want you to know is that don't be surprised if the trustee, the successor trustee, makes changes to that portfolio. And it may have been successful. It may have been good for the decedent, but the trustee has a challenge in making sure that the portfolio is now designed for the beneficiaries in mind. The trustee has a choice of asset classes. Asset classes are just categories of like investments. Cash or cash equivalents typically means that we're talking about banks, certificates of deposit, money market funds, and T-bills. These are very liquid assets. They're considered typically very safe. There are equities, which typically mean stocks, exchange traded funds, and mutual funds. Equity simply meaning that there's an ownership in a capital asset, such as a stock. There is the fixed income asset class, bonds, T-notes. What's been added in more recent, I will say, decades is there's alternatives class. Just to back up, it used to be stocks, bonds, and cash. That was the investment asset class categories that people typically chose from. But then they realized that there are certain asset classes like alternatives, like gold or precious metals and collectibles, that react differently, that may go up in value when, say, for instance, stocks and bonds are going down. You might also see on some statements that there is a real estate category. There might be real estate that is outright owned by a trust. And then there are liquid type of investments such as real estate investment trust and exchange traded funds that participate in the ups and downs of the real estate. So these are the asset classes that the trustee has to create a portfolio that will match what the beneficiary's needs are. And you will see these asset classes typically on a statement when you get in accounting. Now, going back to the traditional stock, bonds, and cash, we see that stocks over long periods of time, this is growth over 40 years, stocks earn about 10% per year, bonds about 5%, and then cash about 3%. So one might well wonder, well, why don't we just invest everything in stocks and equities? The reason you don't always pick stocks is because we don't know if, say, for instance, we're right at the beginning of a bear market where you can lose up to 35% the value of your portfolio. Or maybe you're at the beginning of a bull market where you can earn 35%. And these things, you just don't know. The fact that we know that equity provide very handsome returns over long periods of time doesn't mean that there is not downside volatility. And it is that time element. If the trustee is holding assets for a long period of time, then they can afford to take downside risk, because we know that, for instance, stocks have always recovered. So don't be surprised if the trustee does not put everything into equities, everything into stocks, because of this volatility. And also know too that the trustee might use alternative investments to offset those downsides. These are my numbers. I just picked these out because I've just seen this over time in my 40 plus years of doing what I'm doing, is that short-term hold typically means 1 to 2 years. Intermediate term means sort of 5 to 7 years. And then long-term investments are over 10 years. So in those long-term investments that are going to be held for over a 10-year period, typically that's where you'll find more of an equity-based portfolio. So you increase equity exposure if you know you have a long time period. You decrease equity exposure and go more towards cash when there is a short period of time. Now, in staged payouts, we still have this immediate payout need. So in my example previously, I used the example of a 25% payout. Don't be surprised if 25% of the assets are held in very liquid category. And that is because, even though, once again, to repeat myself, even though we know that equities over time will do better, we don't have a lot of time on that immediate payout portion. In a staged payout, the trustee will consider the immediate cash needs, short-term cash needs in a year or two, and then balancing the remainder of the assets that will be held for a period, depending on how long that period is. I want you to understand the trustee's approach is to be a prudent and balancing those assets and diversifying assets. Now, here's the important statement. It's diversification over asset classes. So we've got equities, bonds, cash, alternatives. And within those asset classes, so in the equities portion, we just don't buy one stock. There's going to be a diversified portfolio of stock. And the rule of thumb that I've seen is that you don't want one asset to comprise more than 10% of an entire portfolio, because that's where it becomes a danger point. And by the way, one of the ways this is accomplished is using exchange traded funds and mutual funds, which are diversified. And there's a great variety today of diversified exchange traded fund and mutual funds. You can literally buy an equivalent of the Standard & Poor's 500 by buying an exchange traded fund. So you want diversification over asset classes, stocks, bonds, cash, alternatives. And then you want within those asset classes to be diversified and putting all eggs in one basket, so to speak. And I want to say also, what will happen is that the prudent trustee will often rebalance. So as assets go up in value, the trustee may sell off well-performing assets and reinvest in low-performing assets. You're selling high and you're buying low. Beneficiaries sometimes come to me and say, well, why did my investment advisor sell off this stock? It was doing so well. And it's because you run the danger of that asset getting to comprise a large portion of the whole entire portfolio. So you need to sell off and you need to reinvest. And by the way, I want to say that you as a beneficiary should be on top of the trustee or the investment advisor and question what they're doing. You want to make sure that they're not being either too aggressive or too safe. And that changes in different circumstances. Just know that it is considered prudent to diversify over asset classes and not trying to predict the market. So what do? You want to assert your rights to an accounting of assets. You want to take a look at statements. A lot of this is done on brokerage statements or bank statements, where it's very easy to give a quarterly or even a monthly report on assets. You want to take a look at that accounting to make sure that expenses are reasonable, that there is cash being held at an appropriate amount to cover expenses and to make the near-term payouts. Don't expect home runs. Expect reasonable rates of return. Accept volatility for long-term assets. When you get a statement and you see that something is down in value, it may just be that it is an acceptable volatility given the long-term hold. And this is a very opportune time, this period when a fiduciary is holding your assets, to think about what you're going to do, how you're going to invest your money once you receive it. If it's a large amount of money, be very careful. I think everybody knows out there that unearned money drops into someone's lap. Sometimes it can be devastating. Just read the statistics on lottery winners. Many lottery winners are broke in a few years. They think it's going to last forever. And so they overspend. They take chances. They may want to talk to an investment advisor about what to do in your personal circumstances, what to do with these assets once they're received. And but just be very careful and use this time wisely. Thank you very much. This ends the second part of this 3-part episode about when assets are held in custody pending the payout to the beneficiary. Next time, I'm going to talk about split interest and where there is an income beneficiary and a ultimate principal beneficiary. But remember that the information here is intended solely for educational purposes and should not be considered legal, investment, or tax advice. For specific guidance in these areas, you should seek your own qualified professional legal, investment, or tax advisor. All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.